I know we're also live streaming, so we're grateful for those that are watching elsewhere today. It is just a gift to be together. As we begin, let's start with a word of prayer. God, we give thanks for the gift of this day, the opportunity to grow closer to you, to one another, and to deepen our understanding of who we are as your beloved children. We ask that you would be with us in this time, give us great joy and the things we think and talk about together. In the name of Christ we pray, amen. There are a number of things in this space that might be happening around the edges today, including continued preparations for the 11 o'clock service may be happening on cue. Here it comes. Yeah, I always like to say that we talk about saints. Larry and Martha, many don't realize, have for over 20 years, every Sunday morning, prepared the table for us. And others have joined with them along the way. They would be quick to point out. But they are here like clockwork, and what a gift that is. Because it does take all of us in the church to play our part. One of the great gifts today is the opportunity to have John and Wynn with us as our Pace Warren speakers. And we've already, many of us, had an opportunity to experience at 8:30 just the beauty and depth and grace that is coming in. The website and newsletter has had all the detailed biographical information about them, so I don't really want to go into that now. If you really love that, pull it up on your phone today while you're here. But what I can say as a way of introduction, and then I'll turn it over to them, is, words, you've probably heard a million times, words create worlds. And we live into the worlds that our words create. And that's exactly how these two made my world better. And a long time ago, probably 12 years, we were dealing with some things in our lives, and I reached out to Wynn just because of his words. Words matter. They form us. They show us a new way of life and living. And through Wynn's words, got to meet John and hear his words. And their friendship together is a great gift to behold. And so as we considered whom to invite for this year, I cannot imagine, after the pandemic 5-year break from the Pace Warren, to have a better friendship, better people of faith than John and Wynn. And I'm just so grateful that you're here today, and that Miska and Meredith were able to be with you as well. In this time, what we'll do is let them think before us with a printed title of Threads of Courage in a Fearful, Cynical World. We are mentioning that now because that may be the only time you hear something about threads of courage. I mean, we always print, and then we let the Spirit move. And so whatever we'll think about together in the realm of hope, we are grateful for Wynn and John being with us today.
Well, it is good to be here. It's especially fun to be here with John. He's one of my just dearest and truest friends, and we don't get to do things like this together very often, so I'm hoping that this is kind of the start of something. But I thought I would share with you, so John's a poet and a writer, and I'm a writer too and a pastor, and we've been friends for a long time, and maybe 6 years ago or something like that, 5 years ago, we thought we should write a book together. We thought it was a brilliant idea. And so John kicked us off. So some of you may have written books too. Whenever you're trying to toss an idea to a publisher, you have to create this document that basically describes what your book's about and how you're going to sell it and how they're not going to go bankrupt trying to sell your book and this sort of thing. And so John started us off on this document, and we immediately landed on the title. And the title was "Hope is a Dangerous Thing." Just curious, anybody remember where that line might come from? Does it ring any bells? Okay. Well, one of our favorite movies is Shawshank Redemption. Have you seen Shawshank Redemption? And there's this scene where they're in the prison, and this is early in the movie, and Red tells Andy, "Hope is a dangerous thing. It just might kill a man." But then, no spoilers. I mean, Shawshank's been out for 20 years, so if you haven't seen it by now, it's on you. But at the end, you realize hope is a dangerous thing, and it might kill a man, but it's also what helps a human to live, that we can't live without hope. And so we landed on this together because what we realized really is there's very few things that are more at the core of what John and I shared together, of how we see the world, some of the ways that made us love one another, is amid a world that is cynical, and maybe for good reasons a lot of times, amid a world that if you happen to be, when John was preaching this morning and he kind of went through this litany, I mean, it's really awful. But precisely because of the God we believe in, the story we believe in, revealed in Jesus Christ, that's never the final word, that there is always hope. And I think John even coined the term that he and I are, maybe others too, are hope mongers. Not fear mongers, hope mongers. And not that it's some like easy, soft, idyllic, ignore what's awful and unjust and evil. Quite the opposite. It's that because this hope is so strong, we don't have to ignore that we can step into it. And so we wrote this proposal, and we thought it was brilliant, and nobody wanted to publish it. And ever since then, a couple times we've said, "Do you remember the best proposal we've ever seen in our life?" And like, yeah, well, nobody's done it. But here today, we kind of get to talk about it, about hope being a dangerous thing. And so this is close to our heart.
Yeah, it is. I echo everything that Wynn said there. People have asked us in the past, how did we become friends, and when did that start? I told Wynn not too long ago, we need to come up with a fantastical origin story, of how, some kind of Romulus and Remulus thing, how our friendship began. But I think it began in the publishing world. I believe that I shadow edited one of the books that Wynn was writing. And I think that's how we initially came together. But a friendship is built over the years, and without any kind of reservation, I say I love this man. He is a friend that I would, go to the mattresses for, so to speak. So the opportunity to be with him here today at the invitation of John and your church here at Pace Warren Lecture Series is truly a privilege. So as we talk about hope, we all are also aware of this being All Saints Sunday. And again, I'm going to read from my phone, okay, because it's 2023. But he died a few years ago. It's a poet by the name of John O'Donohue. And these words popped up in something that I saw, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I think, and I shared them with Wynn as we were trying to prepare for today, our thoughts. But I just want to read them to you, and it's about those who have already gone on to that next place, okay? The dead are not distant or absent, they are alongside us. When we lose someone to death, we lose their physical image and presence. They slip out of visible form into invisible presence. This alteration of form is the reason we cannot see the dead. But because we cannot see them does not mean that they are not there. Transfigured into eternal form, the dead cannot reverse the journey and even for 1 second re-enter their old form to linger with us a while. Though they cannot reappear, they continue to be near us and part of the healing of grief. And a part of the healing of grief is the refinement of our hearts, whereby we come to sense their loving nearness. When we ourselves enter the eternal world and come to see our lives on earth in full view, we may be surprised at the immense assistance and support with which our departed loved ones have accompanied every moment of our lives. In their new transfigured presence, their compassion, understanding, and love take on a divine depth, enabling them to become secret angels guiding and sheltering the unfolding of our destiny. Now, as I shared that with Wayne and we talked about it, we thought, okay, how's that going to hit in a Presbyterian church? Because that's a little spooky, okay? We're talking about the dead who are always with us. And the truth is, as a culture and even as a religious culture, we don't talk about that very much. We have this Sunday called All Saints Sunday in which we remember those who have gone on. But after that, I mean, we're ready for Advent and Christmas, let's stop thinking about that. So it's kind of a one time in which we focus on some of that. But this notion of the saints being present with us, and even possibly, and I don't have a lot of data to share with you about this, but even the possibility of them having their fingers in our business ever so slightly, that's hopeful to me. That somehow they are assisting us. It could also be a little unnerving because I have some who have died and gone on who are rascals, okay? But hopeful nonetheless. Yeah.
So I started thinking about what is the connection between profound hope in Christ and the communion of saints, which is what we're talking about on All Saints Sunday. And in the historic creeds, we confess the communion of saints and we just kind of breeze past it. But today is a day when we're invited for this one moment to just pause. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about communion of saints? And why is that hopeful? Why does that give us hope in a world where hope is sometimes really hard to hold on to? And one reason, I think, is because the reality of the communion of saints insists to us, despite all evidence to the contrary, that we actually are not and never will be alone. Ever. Theologian Ben Myers said, the Bible is obsessed with the unity of humanity. And that one of the expressions of that is the communion of saints. One of the things I wanted to do yesterday, and I was glad when John, your pastor, wanted to do it too. He wanted to bring us here to see your beautiful sanctuary. And I hope that over the years and decades of being here, you don't take this for granted. Like, this is a profound and beautiful space. And space actually shapes us. We know that, right? It's not just something we use. It actually instructs and shapes us. And I wanted to come see the space. And the particular thing I wanted to see, aside from the fact that I just love good church architecture, I wanted to see your stained glass windows, and I was not disappointed. And I was so thrilled to find that you have the little booklets in the back that actually walk through these stained glass windows. And so I'm going to just remind us of something that you don't probably need to be reminded of. Like, this is your church. You know the story way better than I. But just pausing even for a moment and thinking about why do we have stained glass windows in the church? They're beautiful. They evoke a lot. And there's lots of reasons we have it. There's no one reason. I mean, one reason is because it draws our heart outside of ourselves. There's a kind of transcendence that is communicated through these windows. Picture windows were often used in the church because for those of us who weren't able to read, it actually told us the story. That's a profound reality, that the church has always been opening itself up to communicate the gospel to all people. It's not for the educated elite. It's a story of the profound, and there's certain things you can encounter in these stories that you might actually encounter in a different way than when you're reading it in the Gospels, for instance. That's profound. But there's another reason we have stained glass that I think we often don't think about very much. It's because of the communion of saints. It's because we actually believe that in the great mystery of Jesus Christ, that we are actually bound up together in Jesus Christ, that these ones who are surrounding us, these saints from the Old Testament, these saints from the New Testament, that these dear ones are actually with us. And we need to be reminded because we don't see them. And we can be tempted to think of their stories as only moral lessons for us, rather than friends and a certain kind of neighbor in the communion of God, that they are actually with us today. And it's why, for much of the church's history in the modern era, up until probably, I don't know exactly, 100 years ago, oftentimes when you would build a church, what would you also build? What would you put next to the church? Anybody know? A churchyard. Yeah. Why? Well, it's because of the communion of saints. It's because we actually believe that we're always with them and they are always with us. That we literally are worshiping with them. And if you see their marker and it's, Aunt Margaret, who died 60 years ago, that you might be tempted to forget about, but as you're walking up to worship and all of a sudden you walk past Aunt Margaret's tombstone, you remember. And you don't know exactly what it means. I don't actually know what it means for the saints to be with us as we're worshiping and singing today. But it means something. And it means we're not alone. It gives me hope.
I don't know what it means either. But I agree with Wynn fully. It does mean something, and it speaks to that aloneness. I was listening to an interview just a couple of weeks ago with the current Surgeon General of the United States of America. And you think about all the things that the Surgeon General might be concerned about and trying to enact policies to help or to provide assistance for people in light of. But the thing he talked about the entire interview was loneliness. Not whooping cough or something like that you might expect, but loneliness. That was the thing plaguing the United States currently at levels never before. And so all of his attention was focused on trying to find ways really to build community. And that's why we have what the world needs, in so many ways. But one of these truths that the world needs is this idea about the communion of saints, that you're really not alone. Now, it may feel that way, okay? Granted, I give you that. There are days when I feel desperately alone. But if we have any kind of grasp of this truth of the communion of the saints, you're not. Friends and relatives and old neighbors, they're all somehow with us, and as God is, they're for us. There's something profoundly hopeful about that. Again, we don't know what that means, but it means something. And it feels like it's something that's weighty and that is obviously needed. So, yeah.
So I had two ideas that came to my mind this week as I was pondering why does the communion of saints, why does this day where we remember the saints, why does it give us hope? So because we're not alone. And then another reason is because, well, maybe we need to pause first and just ask, what do we even mean when we say saints? It's kind of interesting, like there's a sense in which, obviously, the scripture uses saints to speak of all of us who are in Christ. We are all saints. But there's also this other side, which is if that's all you ever talk about, you know how they say when everything is something, then nothing is something? There's also this other side that, to varying degrees of how we want to talk about this or how we want to understand this, but just maybe at a basic level, much of the church has often said there are also certain people that we recognize as those who have helped to express to us and show to us what it means to be a fully alive human following Jesus. So it's not so much that saints are, even though in iconography it's appropriate, you have the halo, but it's not because this person is perfect, and we've sort of taken that to mean something it doesn't mean. But we can think of a saint as this person that we could never attain that kind of life. We could never be that good. We could never be that prayerful. And I think those saints actually, it flips. It's actually telling us the exact opposite. It's actually telling us it is possible to be a human and to live your life so transfigured and transformed by the love and reality of Jesus Christ that you can become more and more and more truly human. So to be a saint is not to become less human, it's actually to become more human. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, describes saints as holy fools. People who simply have been crazy enough to trust God and say yes. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of brings it down a little bit. I probably can't be St. Augustine, but I can be a holy fool. I can do that. I can hear God's invitation and God's promise, and I can say, all right, that sounds crazy to me, but I'm chips all in on that. Yes, I'll do it. Ben Myers says, the uniqueness of saints, then, is not that they are uniquely whole, but simply that they are really awake, acutely aware of the glorious and troubling difference of God. So the more and more we can encounter what it means to just be a kid, the more and more we can believe that God actually does delight in us, that God is our Father, that our life is wrapped up in God, that we're part of a story that we didn't start. Communion of Saints reminds us that we're part of a really long story. And you know what the really good news about that is? It means we don't end it either. It means that our goodness and our failings do not ultimately circumnavigate the good story of God. Pressure's off. Whew. We can breathe a little bit deeper because it's me and it's Aunt Margaret and it's Augustine and Francis and Mother Teresa and Dr. King, and it's all those who are going to come past us that we don't know now, but we're guardians of this story, and we're just becoming more awake. And we're letting the love of God make us more human. And I want you to talk about your...
Well, I will, but before that, I want you to talk about your friend Eugene Peterson.
Oh, okay.
If you read any of the biographical information that John put online about us, and I haven't, so I have no idea what he said about us. I'm hoping it's valid and true and all that stuff. Wynn had the distinct pleasure of working with Eugene Peterson on a book entitled Burning in My Bones, which is the story of Eugene's life. But more important than his biographer is that you became friends with this saint. Mm-hmm. Have you got maybe just a little story about Eugene Peterson, who he actually was a Pace Warren speaker in the lineup. That's been years ago now. But yeah.
Actually curious, how many of you have heard the name Eugene Peterson? A few. Okay.
Great.
Well, he was very influential to me, and so when I got the chance to write his biography, I was just really overjoyed. And the first year, I had all of his journals from decades, and I was just reading them the first year, trying to get immersed in even more in his interior life. And I remember the day when I was in our sunroom and I was sitting on this little love seat and I was reading a journal, and I came across a line he wrote. And I should say, when he wrote these journals, he never really had any notion that anyone else was going to read them. And in fact, it's an interesting story how I actually commandeered them from him. But he wrote in there, "Lord, make me a saint." And I remember, like, almost, sometimes when you encounter something, there's like almost a catch in your, and I think I was right, I had tears. And it's because I had been immersed in his life. I knew him pretty well. And there was something so deeply true about this prayer he was praying that he wanted to become more human. He wanted to become more who God imagined for him to be. He wanted to become more awake. And over the next years, I was reading his journals. He prayed that prayer over and over and over again. And yet, it's not anything his kids ever heard him say. It's something he would have never have said publicly. It would have been misunderstood if he had said it. Because he wasn't asking to be put on an icon with a halo. What he was asking was, God, make me truly alive. Make me the human you've got me in mind to be. And so maybe 3-4 years before his death, he was interviewed. And I saw this interview. It was filmed. After I had read this line from him multiple times, and the question the interviewer asked him was, what does it mean to be a saint? So I'm like, yeah, you've prayed it. Now I want to hear from you what that means for you. And his first response is, well, someone who's a saint surely wouldn't know they are, because they're so consumed with God that humility is the story that they're living in. And basically he went on and to say to be a saint is essentially to be someone who's becoming more and more transformed by the love of God. And what I encountered in Eugene the night after his funeral, the night of his funeral, a number of his students, he taught at Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia for the last 5 years of his ministry. And a number of these students came to his funeral, and we were sitting in an old house in Montana, as it was drafty and cold. And, there was takeout Chinese food, and everybody was passing around a bottle of scotch. And they started sharing stories about Eugene. And I was just sort of sitting on the outside circle. And what was striking to me was what I did not hear. Nobody mentioned the probably 26 million copies of books he sold. I don't think anybody mentioned his translation of the Message, which is how much of North America knows him. Nobody mentioned the large events he spoke at. Nobody mentioned the Pace Warren lectures. Sorry. Nobody mentioned the far more times that he declined going to those large events because he actually didn't like them. I'm not sure if anybody mentioned his friendship with Bono, he's the lead singer for U2 and how lots of people know him. What person after person after person mentioned was what it was like to be with Eugene. What it was like to sit in a room with him, to come in with a heavy heart, and for him just to receive you. And how 10 minutes later, even if hardly anything was said, you felt more at home and more at peace. What it was like to come in carrying the weight of the world and some profound theological question, and all of a sudden 20 minutes later to have almost forgotten what your question was, because you were with someone who you sensed the deep presence of God in their human person. And when I hear that, what I hear is he was becoming a saint.
That's good. This poem has my name attached to it, all right, as author. This is something I did write, okay? It's entitled My Father's Coffee. I'll tell you, a little over a couple years ago, my dad died. Most beautiful man I've ever known. And He is a victim of the COVID wars, is how I describe it, and all that went on during that horrible time. But this was written prior to that. Here we go. My father's coffee is instant. Boil some water, add the crystals, stir, and there you have it. For years now, I have been the imperialist prodigal returning to my father's house with my own wife and children and my own coffee. I imported Costa Rica peaberry and Major Dickinson's and once some chicory blend dark as the inside of a whale. My father would yield each time, making allowances for my far countrying due to his great love. I would leave, and he would find again his Folgers, like water returning to a low spot. I may have broadened his horizon, but I never changed his mind. But now, with him at his age and me at mine, I would much rather be his son than sophisticated. So from now until then, when in my Father's house, I will drink as my Father drinks. In his house, there is instant coffee. If it were not so, I would have told you. In different ways, but in similar ways, like Eugene, my dad was a saint, becoming more and more human. He was a Southern Baptist preacher, not minister, not pastor, but preacher, okay? He had the tendency to roam back and forth and to raise his voice and to get a little sweaty during his sermons. He was a preacher. But it was interesting as I began to reflect back on his life, some of this becoming more and more human stuff, because if your dad's the preacher, you have a picture of him that maybe a congregation would have, and then you have what he is at home and in the everyday life. And sometimes those things, equal out, and sometimes they're drastically different. But one story I'll share about you, and it kind of underscores this idea of not necessarily having your halo on too tight, okay? To be a saint. There was a stretch of time there, pretty much my entire grade school years, in which we lived in a place called Texarkana, Texas. Sits right on the Texas-Arkansas line. And my dad was a pastor of a fairly large Baptist church there. But as any honest pastor can tell you, regardless of the size of a church, there are pressures and stressors and anxieties and in the midst of all the beautiful things. And he was trying to do a good job. He was a young, probably in his 40s when we moved there. But I can remember that my dad there was an early service and there was a later service. That's when that kind of came into vogue, I think. So he would preach twice, and then there was some kind of Sunday luncheon. We'd be invited. That's when people used to invite pastors to your homes, and we would go to so-and-so's. You've mentioned Aunt Margaret twice, so I guess we'd go to Aunt Margaret's, place for lunch or something. And then there would be the afternoon, and then in the Baptist tradition, about 5 p.m., like choir rehearsal would start, and 5:30 would be training union, and all these kinds of things, so that the Sabbath day of rest was anything but a day of rest. But I can remember after a long day of being the preacher and being on, my dad would come in the evenings, and usually my mom would go on to bed. I would stay up and possibly peek around the corner. He thought I was in bed, I think, but I wasn't. But my dad would turn on PBS. And you might remember there was a time late at night on Sunday evenings, probably on the weekends on PBS, when they would crank up those British comedies. Y'all remember some of those? Mm-hmm. Now, some of them were kind of randy a little bit, all right? Things you wouldn't expect a Baptist preacher to be watching. I think that's why my mom went to bed. She hated them. But after a long day, in a sense, of handling the holy, my dad needed a little bit of the human to meld with that, just to continue to become a saint. And I can remember him sitting there by himself, just laughing at the television screen, these British comedies, and there were several. They'd play for about 20 minutes, and then the next one would begin. But that's the way in which my dad found some balance for his life to become more of a saint. Without that, he wouldn't have. He would have been less human instead of more human. And I've thought about that many times, and I've spoken to a couple of, John is a part of our cohort at Western Seminary, and some of the guys there who are pastors as well. I told them that story the last time we were together. They looked at me like a cow at a new gate, like, what are you talking about? But it was an attempt to try to help them have something they could do there as they spend so much time, as I said, handling the holy, to try to balance that with the human, because that's what it means to be a saint. The halo's not on quite so tight. And so the result is oftentimes laughter at the end of a long day. So anyway,
So kind of switching gears, but not really. I was also struck by the passage that also often gets read on a day like All Saints, the Hebrews 11. The saints, those who are surrounding us, the great cloud of witnesses. The great cloud of witnesses, and they're here. They're not just images. The images are reminding us that they're actually here. But it's a beautiful passage, Hebrews 11, but it also is kind of disturbing, the way it goes toward at the end. And it starts listing all the ones who are martyred, killed, and it says this. It says, yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised. Since God had provided something better. So we're talking about martyrs. We're talking about some who went to their final breath feeling as aware of the fact that they actually hadn't received all the promise of God that was coming. And for some of us, that's going to be our experience too. We're going to come to a moment where we breathe our last, and what we're aware of is that all of the promises of God we actually haven't yet seen. So what would that something better be? This is what Hebrews says. God had provided something better so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Do you hear that? So that they, these great cloud of witnesses, named and unnamed, would not, apart from us, be made perfect. So there's some sense, and this kind of goes back into the category of I don't know exactly what this means, but there's some sense in which this great cloud of witnesses, and maybe we could just pause for a moment and think of the great cloud of witnesses in our own story. Not the ones in Hebrews 11, but Dad. Who are your witnesses? We're going to take a minute. Just, who's your great cloud? Whoever comes to your mind, you are so a part of their story that in some sense, you actually are part of helping them be made perfect in Jesus. Because what this is about is the communion of all of us together. And there is some sense that we are part of those who are coming behind us, and those who are coming behind us will be part of us. And this is the great, great story. So that means your dad and somehow is relying on you.
Yeah.
My mom is relying on me. My grandparents. St. Augustine, who I said I could never be like, in some way. Mother Teresa. And it's a profound thing, is it's not relying on you, like you got to get it right. It's us, the communion, all of us. The great story of what God is doing in us, and that we are part of it, and it's coming into being with us, and it's something that God is working out, and we're part of it, and we can both relax and know that we're called to faithfulness. So I was going to close with this poem, but I don't know if you have something else to share.
I think that'd be a great closing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, I think one final way I want to mention that the communion of saints brings us hope is Paul talks repeatedly about the fear of death, how death holds a power over us. And Scripture says that actually in Jesus Christ this fear can be undone. And I think there's something about the communion of saints that plays into that, because one thing that's mostly true about every saint we know and don't know that's gone before us is they've died. That is the great equalizer. Whatever differences or distinctions we might have in this room even this morning, one of the truest equalizers of all of us, one of the things that binds us together is there, unless Jesus returns prior, at some point, every one of us in this room is going to breathe our last breath. And there is the great, massive company of God's people who have entirely, to the person, gone before us. And Stanley Hauerwas, you might know him, the rascally theologian. For at least a season of his life, he read this poem from Monk Gibbons every morning. It's called The Last Thing. Who'd be afraid of death? I think only fools. I think only fools are. For it is not as though this thing were given to one man only, but all receive it. The journey that my friend makes, I can make also. If I know nothing else, I know this: I go where he is. O fools, shrinking from this little door, through which so many kind and lovely souls have passed before you, will you hang back? Harder in your case than another? Not so. And too much silence? Has there not been enough stir here? Go bravely. For where so much greatness and gentleness have been already, you should be glad to follow. Go bravely. For where so much greatness and gentleness have been already, you should be glad to follow. So they are, in the words of Hebrews, they're cheering us on to become more human, to become more awake, to become more transfigured by the love of God, to become more alive to God's purposes in the world, to become more our true self, and then when it's done, to follow the path into even deeper life. So there's hope.
We're very, very grateful for the opportunity to be with you all here today. And a couple times earlier in the service, we mentioned the year 1983. That's when the Pace Warren lectures were begun. That's when the endowment started. So I can only think there were some Pace Warren saints who are smiling today, somehow, somewhere around here. Again, we can't really explain it, and it kind of sounds a little spooky, but they're cheering us on and saying, "Yeah, that's why we gave this money, so that you all could be together on, November the 5th and 2023." And they couldn't see it, but they lived with that kind of hope. So, yeah, just great to be with you.
Join me in thanking them for not only being here, but for what they have shared with us. John and Wynn, thank you so much. And you can see the gift, oh my goodness, that they bring. And I really encourage you to check out. They each have websites. They each have multiple things they've written and published. They're just a gift to the church, and the world needs more words like what they bring. So thank you. And they've given me some great questions for later today that I'll ask. So, because I want to ask a question to see if there's anything that they think they do know. It's like everything they said, we don't know what it means, but I think we know what they meant, right? So what a gift. Take some time now between now and the 11 o'clock worship when we'll be preaching, and just spend some time welcoming them in person. Thank you, guys.